Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the the Two Guys and a Bible radio broadcast right here with Don Preston on Fulfill Radio. This is William Bell, and I'm delighted to be with you today. Let's see if we can get Don in. I'm sure you had probably a problem or two, maybe, trying to dial in, but let's see what happens when we open the line. All right, Dr. Don, are you there? Hello. Testing 1, 2. Ladies and gentlemen, looks like we might be having an issue here. Let's see if we can resolve this. I hope that you can hear me okay. Let me see if I can get him in. Okay, we're going to try that one more time. Don, are you able to hear me now?
I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. We're good.
Very good. Very good. Well, I'm working with my laptop tonight, and I have a brand new set of earphones. And so in my test, everything looked good. But, of course, on my desktop and my other set of earphones, they look good as well. So, I'm just hoping that the quality is okay with everyone and that everyone can hear me, that you can hear me well, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, well, it's better than it's been in several weeks now. So it's a lot.
Okay, very good.
So that's good.
Well, it may be that the sound card on my desktop is going bad. We've had several storms in our part of the country over the last 6 or 8 months, and with some lightning in which it knocked electricity off, and it did this and it did that. So it's very possible that it did some damage to my sound card on my desktop. So anyway, it's good to be here. Glad to hear that my audio is somewhat better, and hope it stays that way. And so, how are things in Memphis, Tennessee, William?
Well, so busy today, I hadn't had time to even figure out what's going on in Memphis, Tennessee. For the most part, caught a few news clips, maybe a couple of on Facebook, and that's about it. So other than that, I'm just like an ostrich with my head in the sand because I don't know what's happening around. Other than that, things are fine. So, the city is still here. I guess that's a good thing.
Well, I'm glad to report, by the way, that one of our listeners, Rod Rupert, just let me know that my audio is good. So that's an encouragement. That does let me know that my desktop is the issue. And so I guess I'll be using my my laptop to do this program until I can find out what in the world is going on. I may just have to get another sound card in that computer. But at least it's working good, and that's great. That's great to hear. I can also try this new set of earphones with a microphone and see if that works. It has indeed been a busy week. I've shared with you, William, that for some reason or other, and I think I've mentioned it on air even, that for at least a year, I've been having this really nasty habit of waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning. I did that this morning. No apparent reason. I was just awake. And now, for someone like you that's up every 30 minutes studying, writing, and then you'll take a 20-minute nap, and then you go to sleep for 30 minutes. Then you wake up and do it all over again. That may not be unusual, but for Mr. Preston, that's – say what?
I'm in rehab now. So at least I've been trying to get to bed. On good nights, I will go as early as 10 o'clock.
Wow.
Average time is 11. But when I do go to bed at that time, then I'm up at 2 or 3 in the morning. And, at the latest, like 1 o'clock is now my curfew. Is the latest time that I'll try to stay up. Because, hey, I had a birthday. So I got to start respecting, that at least.
Yeah. Well, I try to get in bed no later than 9. And that way, when I'm up at 3:45, then I'm okay. But I tell you, when I'm waking up at 2 o'clock, this is just not a good thing. And I don't know what to do about it. I really don't know. Jan says, well, you just need to work harder and wear yourself out, and that way you'll just sleep longer. And I said, work harder? Really? Seriously? Oh, goodness. So I don't know. I don't know. Just get. Go ahead.
I said if I went to bed at 9 o'clock, I'd be up bright-eyed and bushy-tailed at 1 o'clock.
I know. And, this is something new for me. I've never had this problem of waking up at 2 or even 2:30. I've just never had that problem. And so to encounter it now is just rather perplexing, and it's really kind of frustrating as well, I might add. But it is what it is because I can't seem to avoid it. And so I'm just trying to find ways to work around it. And, of course, about 2 o'clock, 1:30, or right after lunch, whichever comes first, that crash time comes, and I can't even hardly hold my head up. It is nap time. And I'm not like you because you can take a power nap, 15, 20 minutes, and you're good to go. Me, when I go to sleep after lunch, I'm dead to the world for 2 hours. And I absolutely hate it. And I've tried to work around it, and I've tried to work through it. But I find myself sitting at the desk, crashing over into my keyboard. So that's not the optimum thing to be doing. But anyway, like I said, it is what it is. And on another note, boy, I tell you, William, just continue to get these absolutely incredibly encouraging emails from people. I've gotten so many emails lately over the introduction of my new book, The Death of Adam, The Life of Christ. I've had people contact me over and over and tell me that the book is turning their theological world upside down. It's changing everything that they ever thought that they knew, but it's exciting, it's thrilling, it's liberating, and it's convincing. And so that on that level, of course, it's obviously very gratifying. And then just add to that the continuing amount of emails from people and phone calls from people that are just discovering the truth of fulfillment. And so it's absolutely fantastic. By the way, on a slightly different note, did you get the emails that I sent you today?
I did, and I read through them.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to make sure that you had gotten them. I'm still having massive problems with my email. I don't know what in the world's going on. I can't seem to get it figured out. Some people are getting my emails. Some people are not. Some people are able to send me emails. Some are not. I had one guy send me, Holger sent me a manuscript, and he sent it to Gmail this morning, and then he sent it to my regular email address, and I didn't get it on my regular one, but I got it through Gmail. So It's just crazy. I have no clue what in the world is going on with my email. So, folks, if you're listening, and whether live or you'll listen on archives, if you've been trying to contact me by email and you haven't been able to, and you're wondering why in the world Preston hasn't responded to you, it's probably because I haven't gotten your emails. So please be patient with me as I try to work through that. Anyway, as we've said so many times, really, really exciting times that we're living in as more and more people discover the truth of covenant eschatology.
That is definitely the case. And as you say, people continue to express their interest. I was talking to a guy today who called, who had listened to, some of those Hebrew Israelite debates, and he was just saying, he says, you're way over these guys' heads. And he was talking about one of the last ones I had where a guy said he had just heard of preterism a day before, but now he's going to enter into a debate.
Oh,
of course he had a,
that's probably not the smartest thing in the world to do.
Yeah, but he had a partner with him, and the partner is somebody that they respected pretty highly, but found out that he almost knew as little about it as the other guy in the process. But the good thing about it was these guys are able to see through that, and so they were. He spoke very positively about the view and said, most of the time when I listen to you, he says, I'm not all the way there, but he says, I'm beginning to see a lot of what you're saying, and it makes a lot of sense. So that's good. And we just
I've had at least 3 or 4 people over the last week and a half contact me and say, I don't know that I can't say that I'm fully convinced yet, but the more that I listen, the more that I learn, the more that it makes sense. And I'm thrilled to be able to continue to watch your videos and to read the articles on your website and what have you. So, it's people like that are such an encouragement, who are just very candid and say, look, what you're presenting to me is absolutely mind-boggling. It changes everything I've ever been taught, but I'm willing to listen, I'm willing to learn, and I'm going to keep examining what you have to say. And that, of course, stands in really stark contrast with so many people that we encounter, for instance, on Facebook, and they claim that they were full preterists, and my impression of some of them, not all of them, but my impression of some of them, they might have claimed to have been a preterist for 30 minutes or so, or maybe a year or so. But when they explained the reasons why they became preterists, you realize that their reasons were extremely tenuous, and I don't mean that their reasons weren't valid as initial challenges to futurism, but when you realize that that's the only thing that they were clinging to, and that they didn't go beyond that, they didn't continue to study and to learn, and now they are writing books against covenant eschatology. And when you read what they have to say against the fulfilled view, then you realize that their only reason for abandoning the truth, in fact, was because of the patristic writers. It was because of church history. It wasn't because of exegesis. It wasn't because they discovered that the preterist hermeneutic is false. No, it's because they found out, oh my goodness, preterism is not in the creeds. Oh my goodness, preterism is not in the early church writers. And, I mean, we've got to accept what the early church writers said. And so on many levels, you discover that the reasons for abandoning the truth are just tenuous, they're shallow, they're facetious, they're untenable. And you just, I have in my hand, as I'm talking, a book entitled Hope Resurrected by a man named Lance Connolly. And, I tell you, this guy claims to be somewhat. He claims now to be the expert on refuting covenant eschatology. And all you have to do is to read the very first chapter, My Reasons for Writing This Book. And as I hinted at a moment ago, his reason for writing the book is because when he was a preterist, according to his claim, someone suggested to him that he needed to read the early church writers and to read the creeds and to see what they had to say. And it suddenly dawned on him that none of the patristics, none of the early church writers were full preterists. Oh, my goodness, he can't be a full preterist then, because after all, none of the early church writers were. And so, I mean, it's just, it's really quite amazing, and it's sad when you encounter people like that. And it's so refreshing when you encounter people who, on the exact opposite of that, are willing to say, well, it really doesn't matter what the patristic writers said. Really doesn't matter what the creeds say. What really matters is what the Bible says, and that's where I'm going to take my stand.
That's exactly right. And, you know, what you end up discovering when you start following these guys who put so much, you know, credence and stock in the creeds is if you read them clearly enough, long enough, you'll find out that they're contradicting themselves left and right. And then acknowledging, like, you know, the situation was with Michael Holloway, when he quotes from Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr ends up telling us there are many faithful Christians who believed otherwise, didn't believe in a bodily resurrection, you know, physical body rising from the dead.
That's right.
He called them many faithful Christians. So these guys were aware that there were differences of views, and yet they hone in on the one that suits them and try to deny the other. And there are all kinds of traces and evidences of some of the doctrines that relate to preterism in those writings. All people have to do is just carve them out.
Yeah, and what you say there is, I mean, it's so incredibly true, and you can so easily find things in those early church writings that just completely refute what these guys are saying, as you pointed out there. I mean, Justin Martyr's comments on the faithful Christians who did not believe in the resurrection of the physical body, I mean, it's earth-shattering for these guys. But, of course, they go, well, you know, that's just one guy. and, you know, just recently on Facebook, I had asked Sam Frost and Lance Conley, Jeff Cunningham, and some others, is physical death the enemy of the child of God who is forgiven of their sins, washed and cleansed in the blood of Christ? Well, Frost came back, and all he offered was ridicule. Well, Preston wants us to believe that suffering cancer and heart attack and the loss of loved ones, that's good news. That's wonderful. You know, which of course is no answer whatsoever. But the interesting thing about it is when you read some of the early writers, Athanasius is a prime example of this. Athanasius, over and over and over again, talks about how death has been crushed. Death has been defeated. We no longer suffer death as a curse, as was true in aforetime. He does everything except, quote, from 1 Corinthians 15, by the way. And so here's Athanasius. And by the way, several other of the early church writers say exactly the same thing. Death is defeated. Death has been overcome. We have life. We have immortality. Death is no longer the enemy. And if you show this to these guys, these so-called former preterists, if you show these quotes, all of a sudden, what the patristics say don't matter. It doesn't matter after all, even though they'll quote them all day long to make their point.
Here's their stock answer. Here's their stock answer. Yeah, but none of them were preterists. They all believed in the future coming. So regardless of how much preterist or preterist, I can't even say it, Doug. But no matter how many statements that they make in support of preterism that demonstrate, you know, if you follow it to its logical premise, it's just like you're dealing with, you know, many of the amillennialists when we wrote that article, to whom must we go? If you take all of their statements and follow them to their logical end, you're going to end up with preterism.
That's right. No question about that. Absolutely not. So anyway, it's more than interesting. In fact, I'm currently working on an article on this issue of is physical death the enemy, and I'm going to be using a lot of these quotes from the early church writers to demonstrate. And by the way, as I pointed out in one conversation just the other day, those who today want to claim that physical death is the enemy of the child of God evidently have never read from the Fox's Book of Martyrs. And the view of the early Christians, the earliest Christians, including Paul and the New Testament writers, by the way, all of whom not one time expressed the belief that physical death is now the enemy of the child of God. Rather, we have Paul saying he had a desire. Now, the Greek word there is epithumia, and it is a Greek word that in some context is translated as lust. It is earnest desire, earnest longing. Paul said, I have a desire to depart and to be with Christ. And that hardly speaks to a guy who felt like physical death was his enemy. And of course, I've asked Sam Frost if it's true, as you say, as he does, that when the faithful Christian dies, they're ushered directly into the presence of God in heaven. Exactly how and why is physical death the enemy of the child of God, since it transports the person to heaven? No answer. I've asked that question no less than three or four times now. Now, no doubt whatsoever, as human beings attached to physical relations, physical acquaintance, physical love, we hate it when that love is terminated in death. And yet, what do we hear in sermon after sermon after sermon at funerals? You know, I attended I never will forget this. I attended a funeral at Hilton, Oklahoma, some years ago. And the funeral was a very, very faithful Christian woman. She was just such a picture of decorum and grace. She's just a wonderful Christian lady, known for her benevolence, known for her generosity, known for her wonderful spirit of love. And the preacher got up and said, the death of a Christian is the Christian's finest hour. And that really, really struck me. And then, amazingly enough, after stating in his sermon that a Christian's death is the Christian's finest hour. Why? Because it takes him to heaven. Well, first of all, here's a typical Church of Christ preacher who doesn't believe you go to heaven when you die. So he was contradicting his own theology, as it turned out. Then, later in that very same sermon, and William, you've witnessed this yourself, you've heard it yourself, in the very same sermon, he turned right around and said, one of these days, this physical body that has succumbed to the last enemy, of which is death, is going to come out of this ground. And you're going, okay, now wait just a moment. The death of this precious saintly woman is her finest hour because it has ushered her into heaven. Yet, it is her enemy that must one day take her out of heaven to come back to earth to get that physical body that she didn't need to be in heaven, to get that physical body out of the ground, be reunited with it, and go back to heaven where she was, where, where she didn't need to have that physical body to be in heaven. And you talk about a confused theology. That's it, right there. I mean, that's the manifestation of a confused theology. On the one hand, the death of a Christian is that Christian's finest hour. On the other hand, they've succumbed to the last enemy. I sat there in that audience, and I kind of looked around. I couldn't help myself. I kind of looked around to see if anybody else was noticing the contradictions in this preacher's presentation. I mean, am I the only one that caught this glaring contradiction? On the one hand, it's the greatest hour. On the other hand, it's succumbing to the enemy. Evidently, nobody else caught it, or if they did, they didn't. They did not let it on with any body language. And so I left that funeral literally shaking my head, going, such is the confusion in the traditional amillennial view of eschatology and view of death and redemption and victory and life after death. Like I said, I'll never forget that day and the confusion that was more than apparent in that minister's presentation.
Well, again, it's so very obvious that you find, those kind of contradictions in, much of the arguments that are being made. And I don't think it's going to stop anytime soon, even though, as, we said earlier, many people continue to discover, fulfilled Bible prophecy, and they are, they're speaking out. And the good thing, and this is something that happened this past week after doing the radio program, they respond with some pretty good comments or some additional resources that maybe you haven't looked at, and that just flows really well with the information that you're presenting. So that's another, advantage and powerful thing about other people who are learning. Once they get it, they're excited, but they take it a further, step and start to presenting information and resources that, you may not have considered, and that just adds to it and allows, everybody to move even faster and more thoroughly in their search for truth.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, well, here we are. We've shared some thoughts like that for about half the program. Let's get back into Isaiah chapter 62 in our discussion of the Messianic temple. And by the way, folks, the book that I mentioned a while ago by Lance Conley is entitled Hope Resurrected. And in my YouTube videos on Fridays, in a couple of weeks, perhaps 3, I am going to be reviewing and responding to Mr. Conley's book. It is a book of, let me see here, it is 491 pages long. And the entire point of Mr. Conley's book is to prove that preterism is wrong. Now, he has a lot to say about my books. He does a lot of extensive comments on my book, on Daniel 12, on my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air. And then, but one of the problems that I have with Mr. Conley is his incredibly immature, incredibly crude, incredibly, at times, vulgar use of language. For instance, on page 389, he calls me a charlatan, and he says, quote, "This charlatan," that's me, according to Mr. Conley, "is just hoping and praying that his readers do not think for themselves and look into the historical facts of the matter from actual scholars and will buy into the con that he's trying to sell people," unquote. And so that's the kind of language, that's the kind of attitude that you find in Mr. Conley's book. And so, again, I'll be reviewing and responding to that book, not in kind, hopefully, but nonetheless, I'll be reviewing what he has to say in the book in hopefully a more professional manner than he wrote the book. So back to Isaiah chapter 62. We have gone over this material to a certain extent. I do want to drive a point home that really, really, really is important. And it is a point that I've used in public debate. It is a point that I have written about in my books, and I would make this observation. The development, the exegetical and the linguistic development that I'm going to share with you ever so briefly this evening, that is in my books. It is in my Like Father, Like Son on Clouds of Glory. It is also, if I remember correctly, in my book on The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat. The linguistic development there, the exegesis, even though I've shared the arguments, shared the material with a wide range of individuals, I have not had to this single day a single substantive remark or response to my arguments. Let me see, how do I express this? The deepest, the most, quote, substantive, unquote, response that anyone has given me is, what you are saying may sound good, and it's valid in one respect, but it doesn't mean it's valid the way you're presenting it.
What does that mean?
And, yeah, I mean, it's like, okay, your linguistics are valid, your logic is good, I just don't accept it in the way you're presenting it. Okay, here's what I mean. Isaiah chapter 62 foretold the time of Israel's remarriage to the Lord. Now, that remarriage is the time of the new covenant. That remarriage is the time of the Messianic temple. It's the time of the kingdom. It's the time in which Israel, that had been forsaken, that had been divorced, would now be called Hephzibah, which is beloved and a rejoicing, and Beulah, which means married. Okay? So at this time, I want you to notice verse 6 and 7. I, that is Yahweh, I have set my watchmen, pardon me, upon your walls, O Jerusalem, which shall never hold their peace day or night. You that make mention of the Lord, do not keep silent, and give him, that's give the Lord, no rest until he establishes and until he makes Jerusalem a praise in the earth. Now, here is Isaiah urging Israel to pray to the Lord night and day without ceasing, and to give the Lord, pardon me, no rest until he establishes Jerusalem. Now, the word establish here in the Septuagint is the Greek word diorthosis. Diorthosis is used in Jeremiah 16. It's used in Jeremiah 23. It's used in other messianic prophecies, which, of course, is what Isaiah 62 is. It is used in other messianic promises and prophecies of the last days restoration of Israel. Under the new covenant, under David the king, that's especially Jeremiah chapter 23, by the way. And so this establishing of Jerusalem, this diorthosis, is the time of the restoration of Israel. Now, what's so significant about that is that in Hebrews chapter 9, the writer speaks of the law. And he lays out before the reader the cultic practice of the Day of Atonement, about how the high priest took the sacrifice, he killed it, entered into the most holy place, and he came back out. I don't know what that was, but it hurt. And so the writer says this: when these things, that's the tabernacle and temple, the altar, the sacrifices, etc., when these things were thus ordained, these priests went always into the first tabernacle, accomplishing the service of God, but into the second. Now here he's talking about That first tabernacle is the very first part of the tabernacle. It was known as the holy place. The second is the most holy place. Into the second, with the high priest alone once every year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the errors of the people. The Holy Ghost is indicating this. And by the way, in the Greek, from verse 8 through verse 10, the writer uses the present active indicatives over and over again. So I'm going to read it using and honoring the present active indicatives. The Holy Spirit is indicating this, that the way into the holiest of all is not yet made manifest, while the first tabernacle is still standing. And it's more technically accurate to say still has standing. It's not talking about the physical standing of the building. He's not saying as long as the building stood, the Torah stood. No, as the way into the holiest of all was not made manifest, was not opened unto man, as long as the tabernacle had validity, as long as the cultus was valid, in other words. Okay, which is a figure for the present time, in which are offered both gifts and sacrifices that could not make him that does or did the service perfect, as pertaining to the conscience, which standing only in meats and drinks and divers washings and cardinal ordinances. Now, catch this, folks. Imposed until the time of reformation. The word reformation here is the Greek word diorthosis. So here the writer of Hebrews tells the readers that the law of Moses, with the temple, with the cultus, would remain valid, having standing. As a matter of fact, you'll notice there that he says that it was imposed. Imposed. The Greek word that is used there means exactly what imposed means. Imposed as valid and binding. Imposed until the time of Reformation. So Israel, the temple, the cultus would remain valid and binding until the time of Reformation, the diorthosis. Well, in Isaiah 62, they were looking for the time of the diorthosis. To put this another way, the diorthosis is the time of the wedding. The time of the wedding is the time of the restoration of Israel. Oh, by the way, the time of the restoration of Israel is the time of the resurrection. Hosea 13, Isaiah 25, Ezekiel 37, Daniel 12. So here we have Isaiah anticipating the time of Israel's restoration, Israel's glorification, Israel's salvation, which is the time of the Reformation. Now, I should point out here, and I think this is highly significant, that here in Isaiah 62, the writer is anticipating that time of the wedding, the remarriage of Israel, as the time of the diorthosis. I'd like to take us back to Isaiah 52, because this is all absolutely interrelated. There's a constant theme that runs throughout the entirety of Isaiah. It kind of chugs along there for a little while, and then in chapters 40 and following, it comes to the forefront. And that theme, that motif, is how, because of her sin, Israel was abandoned, Israel was forsaken, Israel was divorced. But the time was coming in the time of the suffering servant of the Lord, the Messiah, in which Israel would be restored, Israel would be remarried, Israel would be raised from the dead. I'm going to read to you just a tad from Isaiah 52. Awake, awake, put on your strength, O Zion. Put on thy beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city, for henceforth there shall no more come unto thee the uncircumcised and the unclean. Shake yourself from the dust. Arise and sit down, O Jerusalem. Loose thyself from the bands of thy neck, O captive daughter of Zion. Now, what do we find here? We find the image of Israel being asleep in the dust. Awake, awake, O Zion. Shake yourself from the dust. Here is Israel asleep in the dust. Guess what? Daniel would foretell many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall arise. Resurrection. The imagery of sleeping in the dust, all the way back in Isaiah chapter 25, Isaiah chapter 26, is the imagery for alienation from God, being separated from God, being defeated, being downcast. You know, William, as you well know, in the ancient Hebraic mindset, the ancient Hebrews did not have a monolithic concept of death. To them, if you had a chronic, incurable disease, you were dead. If you didn't have any children to carry on your name, you were dead. If you were separated, if a woman was separated from her husband, she was considered dead. If you as a nation were alienated from God through sin, carried off into captivity, you were dead. And so as, pardon me, as one scholar by the name of John Levinson pointed out, the ancient Hebraic view of death is far more comprehensive, far more broad-based than we in the Western world are accustomed to think. And he goes over some of those things that I just mentioned. And he points out that originally in the Hebraic worldview, resurrection was not the resurrection of a biological body. It was the restoration of the national life of the nation back to the land, back to the favor of God, back to a covenant relationship. That was the original concept of resurrection, according to Levinson. Well, it's interesting in the book. He admits that, and then he says, "Oh, but it was changed later
Yep.
into the idea of an individual bodily resurrection." Doesn't do what? Go ahead.
I just said when he starts.
Are you there, William?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound like you're far off, though.
Well, I said when he starts treating
go.
on 12, then he begins to argue that Daniel 12 is the first place where it occurs.
Yes.
One of the reasons why I created the chart to talk about the consistency of what you're saying here on Israel dwelling in the dust. And when you look at all of them, and of course you got Ezekiel and Daniel and Jeremiah, by the way, all contemporary prophets at one time. So it's rather interesting that two of them at least, and of course they had Isaiah before that, would speak about dwelling in the dust, and yet this is the first time where it becomes, bodies coming out of the ground in Daniel chapter 12. It just doesn't make sense at all.
Yeah, it doesn't. It doesn't make sense at all. And so the point being here that I was pointing out is that Isaiah 52 gives us that background, additional background for understanding Isaiah 62. Here in Isaiah 52, the Lord says, you're in the dust, you're dead, but awake from the dead, and put on your beautiful garments. William, what's the imagery behind putting on those beautiful garments?
From my understanding, putting on those garments have to do with the clothing of tabernacle. That's tabernacle concept from what I've understood. Looking at Ezekiel 16, where God talks about entering into a covenant relationship with Israel, and then adorning her with all of these beautiful garments, jewels, etc. But they all had to do with the tabernacle, and so this I would think has the same idea.
I don't doubt the tabernacle imagery is there. I understand Isaiah 52 with the concept of the remarriage and putting on the beautiful wedding garments.
That was the concept of Ezekiel as well.
Yeah, exactly. There's no real contrast between what we're saying here. And so my point in that is Isaiah 52 is put on your beautiful garments because you're getting ready to be remarried to the Lord, the promise of Hosea. Then what do we find over here in Isaiah 62? You will no longer be called forsaken. You will no longer be termed desolate. You're going to be called Hephzibah and Beulah. It's the remarriage. So we have a perfect tie-in here between the idea of remarriage and resurrection. And my goodness gracious, I on the one hand, I understand this perfectly because for how many years did I fail to see this? And on the other hand, now that I see it, it's so clear, it's so clear, it's so plain, and it's so powerful that part of me is going, why can't everybody see this? Why doesn't everybody see this? I mean, because it's so exciting. And yet, William, as you well know, when you present this to an awful lot of folks who are holding to the traditional views, their response, well, that's just the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. I've never heard that before in my life, blah, 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 which, of course, proves nothing at all. In my debate with Mac Deaver some years ago, Mac Deaver got up after I had presented several arguments over and over and over again with syllogistic argumentation. Mac Deaver got up, and all he did was ridicule. And he said, I have never heard such arguments in all of my life. Have any of you people heard these arguments? I've never heard these arguments before in my life. Well, I got back up, and I responded. I said, ladies and gentlemen, Brother Deaver stands up here and tells us he's never heard this stuff, never heard these ideas presented in all of his life. And I said, and I turned to him, I said, Brother Deaver, let me assure you of something. Your ignorance of these matters does not constitute proof of my error. Just because you've never heard of it doesn't mean it's false. And his body language at his table was, I must say, quite, it was worth the price of admission. I have to say that. But the point of it is, again, I spent many years myself not understanding any of this. But once you see the beauty of this imagery, now remember, Isaiah 62 is looking forward to the remarriage. The time of the remarriage is the resurrection. But the time of the remarriage is the time of the diorthosis. And the law of Moses, the old covenant, the old marriage covenant, would remain valid and binding until the diorthosis. Now, going to have to hurry here in order to get all this in. The word diorthosis is a really fascinating word in the Greek. In the Greek, it's sort of, it's used in medical context. And in medical context, in extra-biblical usage, diorthosis is used, for instance, if you had a broken bone, and that broken bone was reset into its proper place. Diorthosis means to correct what is out, to put back in the to put back in the proper place, proper order, proper function, etc. Now, Thayer's gives diorthosis as the restoration of the creation to its proper glory, something to that effect. So, the force of this must simply be caught. Diorthosis means to put back in its proper order, to restore as it ought to be. So, here is Isaiah talking about the time of restoration as the time of the remarriage, as the time of the resurrection, as the time of the diorthosis. Now then, I want to call everyone's attention to Acts chapter 3. In Acts chapter 3, just a few days after Pentecost, in which the gospel has been preached for the very first time, Peter and John go up to the temple, as is their usual custom. They're going to share the gospel of Christ with that audience. They heal a man who's been lame virtually all of his life. And the crowd gathers round. And they preach to them about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And then they call on their audience, repent therefore and be converted, that your sins may be blotted out, when the times of refreshing shall come from the presence of the Lord, and he shall send Jesus Christ, which before was preached unto you, whom the heavens must receive, now watch this, until the times of the restitution. Now I'm reading from the good old King James Version. Until the times of the restitution of all things, which God has spoken by the mouth of all his holy prophets since the world began. Now, the word restitution, and in the New King James and in most translations, more modern translations, they render this as the restoration of all things. This is from the Greek word apokatastasis. And interestingly and significantly enough, this word is a direct synonym of diorthosis. And, pardon me, just like diorthosis is used in Old Testament messianic prophecies of the restoration of Israel, the establishment of the everlasting kingdom of Messiah, likewise, the Greek word apokatastasis is used in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. Apokatastasis is likewise used in Old Testament messianic prophecies of the establishment of the kingdom. So you have two words here, apokatastasis and diorthosis. Oh, and by the way, guess what the definition of apokatastasis is in the lexicons? It means to put back in the proper order. That's why some lexicons give them as direct synonyms. And, by the way, I believe it's Ellingworth, if I'm not mistaken. I have to go back and double check that. But many Greek scholars, I'll put it like that, take note of the fact that apokatastasis and diorthosis are, in fact, direct synonyms. Oh, and by the way, they are both synonyms along with palingenesia, the time of restoration of Matthew 19 and 28. So we have three words here that all speak of the time of the restoration, the time of the resurrection,
and
the time of the kingdom of God. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the time of regeneration.
Exactly, the time of regeneration. Now, notice that just like Isaiah 62 looked forward to the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel as the time of the diorthosis, similarly, Hebrews 9 anticipated the validity of the old covenant system, the people the city, the temple, the cultus until the time of the diorthosis. In other words, the diorthosis. Oh, by the way, you'll notice that Hebrews chapter 9 says that old covenant cultus stood in meats, drinks, divers ordinances. Well, what were those? Those were practices of the feast days, which Paul said were types and shadows of the good things that were about to come. Colossians chapter 2, 14 to 16. And so the writer in Hebrews chapter 9 is expressing the fact that Israel's cultus was typological, as he says in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1 and 2. Now, the law having a shadow of good things about to come. I mean, he's just talked about the temple and the cultus, and he says the law having a shadow of good things about to come. So Israel's prophecies looked forward to the diorthosis. Israel's cultus, her very existence, looked forward to the diorthosis. Acts chapter 3 looked forward to the apokatastasis, the restoration, which is the diorthosis. And Acts 3 would be in fulfillment of what? Well, let's see here. Verse 21 again. Whom the heavens must receive until the times of the restitution of all things, which God has spoken by the mouth of all his holy prophets since the world began, for Moses truly said unto the fathers, a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me. Moses, Samuel, yea, and all the prophets who have spoken, Peter said, have spoken of, quote, these days. That's Peter's days, Peter's first century days. So, one more time, Isaiah 62 looked forward to Israel remaining until the time of the remarriage, which is the resurrection, which is the diorthosis. Hebrews 9 looked forward to the temple cultus as type and shadow, as a foreshadowing of the time of the diorthosis, when Torah would pass away. And the Old Testament foretold the time of the apokatastasis, the time of the restoration, which is the diorthosis, when all of the prophets would be fulfilled. Now, what this does for us, since the time of the restoration is the time of the Messianic temple, and Acts chapter 3 and Hebrews 9 tell us that time of Reformation is synonymous with each other. Acts chapter 3 says the apokatastasis would be at the second coming. But the apokatastasis is the time of Reformation. They're synonyms, remember. And guess what? Hebrews 9 says the time of Reformation is the time of the end of the law of Moses, the fulfillment of all his types and shadows. Well, in the first place, that tells us that the second coming of Christ, to consummate the restoration of all things, is the time of the end of the law of Moses. But it's also the time of the wedding. Remember, the diorthosis is the time of the wedding. Oh, but wait, the diorthosis, as the time of the wedding, is the time of the resurrection. All of these, once again, the time of the Messianic temple. The Messianic temple, therefore, is the time of the resurrection. The Messianic temple, or the resurrection, is the time of the restoration of Israel. The time of the restoration of Israel is the diorthosis. The diorthosis is at the end of the law of Moses. But the diorthosis is the time of the apokatastasis, the restoration of all things, that would arrive at the coming of Christ. And that means the end of the law, the Messianic temple, the resurrection, are all synchronous events. When again? At the end of the law of Moses. So if you say the law of Moses has passed away, you are affirming the wedding has taken place, the restoration of Israel has taken place, the resurrection has taken place, and the Messianic temple has been established. It also means we're out of time. just looked down, and it just turned over 7 o'clock. Folks, thank you so very much for joining us here on Two Guys and a Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. William, always great to be with you. And with that, I'm going to say good night and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys and a Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Dunn Preston and myself, we'd like to say have a very pleasant day and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust.